recorded. All right, there it goes. Recording is going. So, again, this is a new undergrad program for a bachelor's degree of educational psychology at the U of U. One reason that I'm just sharing this is because a lot of students from Salt Lake Community College continue on to the University of Utah. If you do have an interest in psychology, especially applied psychology, a degree in educational psychology might be a really good way to go. So, reaching back to chapter 1 and 2 material, talking about applied versus basic research. So basic research is essentially asking questions and answering questions to just learn, to figure out things, to learn. If you're curious, you might want to figure out, well, how do the neurons of the eye work? What is the average age that cognitive capacities decline? So that could be just basic research, just building to a body of knowledge. Applied research is a lot of what we talk about in a lifespan development class, because so much of it is directly applicable to actually living life. So I am an applied positive developmental psychologist. So I do applied work, doing things for people out in the real world, essentially. So applied positive, we'll actually see some videos from some positive psychologists today, focusing on positive institutions, positive emotions, positive institutional or positive individual experiences, things like that, how to help people thrive. Developmental, again, helping people thrive. What is the developmental life course? How do things happen on average? How can we help people do things earlier or better, or have higher well-being? So developmental is this whole class, what happens across the lifespan. And then psychology, study of how people think, feel, behave, and how we can do things like modify and apply things to help people do all those things better or healthier. So that's where my applied developmental psychology, applied positive developmental psychology comes from. And I would even say I'm an applied positive developmental scientist, because I do the science of doing this. I do studies to figure out what is working and what's not. So having so many words, applied to positive developmental psychologist, scientist, doesn't flow off the tongue as well. So, but my point here is, with that whole tangent, is a lot of what we've talked about in this class is applied work. So if you are interested in the applied work, if there's been aspects that you have liked about application and actually influencing people or treating people or figuring out how to change systems around people, an educational psych degree could be really useful to you. It might be right down your alley. Or looking for another applied one in a specific area. It doesn't have to be the U of U. There's a lot of educational psych programs across the country. If you are interested in something that you don't feel like this quite fits, also feel free to email me. If you're really interested in neurology, or because I know there were a lot of students at the beginning of class who mentioned that they were interested in neurons, the brain, and neurology. If that's what you're interested in, let me know, and I can maybe point you to a couple schools that I know of that might have programs that interest you or might fit well with what you're interested in. So, but this is one that's new. It might be of interest to you. So educational psychology degree would give you you have the opportunity to get specific training that's relevant for Utah. Some of these trainings and certifications will transfer over to other states. Some of them won't, so you'll have to look into that depending on what kind of career you want to go into. But these are the kinds of career paths that would be really useful if you're thinking about that, to get an educational psych degree. So behavioral technician, certified assistant behavior analyst, ABA, applied behavioral analysis, school interventionist or behavior specialist, school psychologist, autism spectrum disorder specialist, child life advocate, academic advisor, community program manager, paraprofessionals in a lot of different areas, student support assistant, or home health aides or personal care aides. So school psychologist, I think I mentioned that, but there's a lot of ways that this connects with a lot of different things. So some other potential programs that are really connected to this are like sports psychology, very applied. This is going to focus a lot. An educational psych program will be looking at development generally in like early, middle, late childhood, adolescence, rather than adulthood, but it's very applied, so really relevant to sports psychology. School counseling, a very immediate direct connection. School psychology, I would even say social psychology as well as social work here, and I would say developmental psychology as well, but occupational therapy, mental health counseling, counseling psychology. So if these are things that have been interesting to you through the class, if you've wanted to get involved in it, this is a new program that exists that you could take a look at. Another document that they sent, and again, I'm not going to read all of this. It gives a little more information about the kind of careers that you might be looking forward to, the kind of wages that you might be looking at in the future. So I'll probably email both these documents to everybody because I don't think the secretary emailed it to all the students. I think they only emailed it to the faculty. So is there any questions about educational psychology or career paths in general right now that I could just answer right now? Or if you have specific questions, you can obviously email me as well. All right, well, let me know if you have any questions about the field of psychology as a career and what kind of programs or things you might be needing to look at going into the future. All right, so let's finish up with this chapter on socio-emotional development in middle adulthood. It transitions really well into what we're going to be talking about in late adulthood. So chapters 15 and 16, that's physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional health in late adulthood. And then chapter 17 is death and the dying process and how it affects people who are left behind. So that is going to be the last couple points that we're making throughout this class. Some things are going to be a little repetitious in these chapters because healthy behaviors going to come up again today. Working on doing cognitive skills going to come up again. We might not get to cognitive today for late adulthood. And then a lot of the socio-emotional things are the same, things that will help you be healthier as in middle adulthood. So, but we have some different focuses, some different challenges as we get into late adulthood. So, we talked about the big five. We'll go on past that. Yeah, I think we did enough talking about the big five last time. All right, so some points that we didn't hit on and I wanted to come back and talk about. We talked about stability, how things in general on average are fairly stable. In midlife, again, this goes back to psychology as a science. We are often trying to predict people's behaviors or predict outcomes or make connections for different outcomes. So when we say that on average, people's lives tend to be more stable. So social context, going to the same kind of job, living with the same family under the roof. So in general, on average, across midlife, most people have a pretty stable midlife. So we're thinking about a bell curve when I say average. So some people will have a lot of change. Some people have very little change. Some people have a little bit of change on average. But that doesn't mean that having a life with a lot more change is bad or good. It just might be correlated or a risk factor or a protective factor for different things. So when we're trying to predict behavior and see what these kinds of behaviors connect to, that's why we do this kind of science. So then we can hopefully help people figure out how to have thriving lives. So one thing that I wanted to mention is that I think actually we did talk about this in this class. We didn't in my earlier class. Let's just make a quick point. So in midlife, most people who are married tend to be pretty satisfied. Divorce rates are lower than they were in early adulthood. Generally, people, if they're going to be getting divorced, have done it by the end of early adulthood or the beginning of middle adulthood. So on average, marriages in middle adulthood tend to have pretty high satisfaction. I don't think we talked about this. We might have mentioned it really briefly, The basic point is that for middle adults, oftentimes towards the end of middle adulthood, if they have their own children, those last children are leaving the house. So with that, that means they now have an empty home. They will fill it in different ways. So maybe they don't fill actually the empty nest. Maybe they go and they take on their own hobbies, find meaning and purpose in other things outside of just those family members and the direct care of those children. So that's a really good way to build on hobbies they had before and creating new hobbies and outlets for creative energy and things like that going forward. But another thing that's fairly common is for middle adults to refill their home with other people. So oftentimes that is older parents that need more direct care, moving in with them and giving direct care to them. Or this can often be, and we see this more and more common now as well, is this is early adult children moving in with parents. And so we talked about this from the early adult's perspective and the challenges that can face to the early adult living back with their parents again. But this is also a challenge for the middle adults, the parents in this situation. It's a very different dynamic when you have a fully adult child who maybe has left and gone to a couple of years of college, or is even working a full-time job but is living with you, maybe moved away for a time and came back. Household schedules and things are going to be different. The dynamics between people are going to be different than when that person was, say, 16 years old. So there's a lot to get used to for the parent as well as for the adult child. So there can be things like loss of privacy, additional stresses involved in there. Hopefully, one thing that can be really good is for the parent and the child to develop more of a peer relationship rather than a parent-child relationship. That child is an adult, and we saw that in a couple of the videos we've seen in middle adulthood, talking about the relationship with children becoming more of like a friendship rather than a direct involvement of parenting. So with a 13-year-old that's early adolescence, you're going to be doing a lot more parent management, managing times and schedules and money and budgets and things like that. For an early adult, you don't need to do those responsibilities as a middle adult, who's the parent of these early adults. So hopefully that's going to be a challenge to get to that point, to be in a more peer relationship, more like roommates rather than like a parent-child relationship, because that's what the pattern has been for, I don't know, maybe like 18 years. So it can be a challenge. But those are two of the most common ways that middle adults refill the nest, refill the home, is with older parents or with with their children who are now adults, or they pursue new interests and with that additional time outside of the home. We talked about sibling relationships. We talked about friendships. They're very important. I think we talked about in this class too, grandparenting as primary caregivers are more common now, and that can lead to a lot of challenges. I don't think we've touched on this enough. I think I mentioned the term kin keepers. So a kin keeper is a member of a family who tends to keep the family together, doing family reunions, calling each other, checking in, delivering messages. So you might have experienced this in, say, maybe a grandparent or even a parent. In their family letter, they write about other members of the family that have maybe moved away, like at a Christmas letter or something like that. You might have experienced that. You might have family members who really often like comment on social media posts you make or something like that, trying to keep people connected or mentioning something about another person in the family. That's what a kin keeper does, trying to tie the multiple generations of a family together. Most often we see this being done with middle adults. They are connecting like their aging parents to their children and maybe even the middle adults' grandchildren, so the great-grandchildren. They're trying to connect these generations. So it's most common then, but this task of being a kin keeper might then extend into late adulthood as well. Can actually be a really positive one. Keeping family together means you're seeing family more often or connecting with them more often, so that can be all really, really good. for mental health. So an interesting thing though, even for these middle adults who are involved in keeping their parents, so the late adult parents, connected with the early adult children and maybe even grandchildren that are in early childhood, um, that relationship is often even characterized by ambivalence, not maybe not having a direct involvement or direct care and concern for the in and outgoings of their parents' life. Um, Even though they're trying to stay connected, there still tends to be, on average, again, a lot of ambivalence in between middle adults and their late adult parents. So again, this is on average. There's people that are going to be really, really, really involved in their older parents' lives, and some that are absolutely not involved at all. But on average, there's a lot of common. It's common for there to be a lot of ambivalence at this time, which is interesting, even when they're also the ones that are doing things like setting up family reunions or things like that. So a couple little differences to point out, just a couple stats. Mothers and daughters, so mothers who are in late adulthood and daughters who are in middle adulthood tend to have closer relationships throughout adulthood. So those relationships tend to get closer. So, and more as peer relationships. I think you'll kind of see that from one of the videos we'll watch in the late adulthood chapter in a minute too. So married men tend to have more involvement with their wives' families than with their own. So going to the wives' parents and families for holidays, things like that, is more common. Again, this is on average. That might not be your experience. In my family, it basically depends on who we live closer to. Right now, we're living closer to my parents. A few years ago, we were living about the same distance from my wife's parents. So for us, it's more down to distance. So, but that's not on average the common thing. So grandparent and grandchild relationships, it tends to be, again, on average, it tends to be maternal grandparents are the closest with the grandchildren. So that would be your mother's parents. On average, tends to be the grandparents that you're closest to. So this is another example. It's not actually the case in my family, and it might not be the case in yours, and that's fine. It might be for a variety of different reasons. Distance, in mine, it was a death in the family, made it so we didn't have as strong a connection to that side of the family. So yeah, and again, individual differences, but psychology as a science is looking both at these averages, stable things, changes, differences, to try and be able to predict behavior, help people live thriving lives, see for people who are living thriving lives, what is it about the life that leads to that thriving? So this brings us to our last point within middle adulthood that will kind of take us into late adulthood. So I've mentioned positive psychology a couple times throughout the course. Developmental psychology and positive psychology have a lot of overlap because developmental psychology, the basic science of it, essentially looks at describing development from conception all the way till after death. So the whole lifespan. Applied psychology looks at, well, at each of these points, how do we maybe fix problems or how do we help people thrive? So that people thriving thing is very closely related to what positive psychology does. So we'll watch this video of Chris Peterson, who's one of the big names in positive psychology. He passed away about 7 years ago now, but a lot of these points are really good, and a lot of the research is still really strong and still being built off of from this video. And then it'll let us transition into late adulthood pretty well. But this point up here, other people matter, that's essentially, oops, too far. That's essentially Dr. Peterson's like slogan around positive psychology. And so it's really important as we think about the end of middle adulthood socio-emotional relationships, other people matter, whether it's close friends, close family, close coworkers. Other people are important for physical, mental, and cognitive health and socio-emotional health for people. So we'll watch a couple points on positive psychology in general, as well as people and building relationships and how, and the couple different domains that can affect. Hopefully a lot of this is not brand new to you and it's like, oh yeah, this is just another way of someone saying these things.
of religion. However, the work I do as a psychologist is within the field known as positive psychology, which has a general definition as the scientific study of what makes life worth living. In addition to happiness, positive psychologists are also interested in talents and abilities, in our passions, the things that we're really interested in. What gets us out of bed in the morning? Whether we're passionate about work, about leisure activities, about our family. My own work is focused on strengths of character, positive traits like kindness and teamwork and sense of humor. Positive psychologists are also interested in the institutions that enable the good life, family, schools, good workplaces, healthy communities. What is the relation?
So that's a pretty good brief overview of what positive psychology focuses on. He talked about what we call the 3 pillars of positive psychology there: positive emotions, positive individual experiences, positive traits, and positive institutions. So depending on who you read, they might call it positive individual experiences. They might focus on positive emotions. So those are kind of overlapping. Then we've got positive traits like the character strengths, kindness, teamwork, wisdom, knowledge. I can't think of humor. These are all some examples of character strengths. Hopefully you remember some of them. I showed you the VIA character strengths. I think it was really recently, just last time when we were talking about the Big Five, or was it before that? I sometimes get my different classes confused if it's the lifespan versus the general classes. Sometimes I show things to the general classes because we have a whole chapter on personality. So I think I showed that to them earlier than you. So I might be mixing those up. In any case, so character strengths, take the VIA. It's really useful. Those kinds of character strengths are talents or abilities that you have. If there's one that you want, you can work on it and build that up and use it. Use that talent, use that character strength in your life, whether it's your work, your hobbies, your relationships. So they're really useful and good things. I just heard an Amazon package got delivered, so hopefully it doesn't get too wet in the rain. Maybe I'll do a break in a little bit and go grab it before it gets soaked. But let's continue this video.
Of happiness to a life well lived. I would say that happiness is often an indicator that you're living well, but it's not a perfect indicator. A lot of the things that we do that make life worth living, raising children, for instance, doesn't necessarily make us happy. Not in the short run. In the long run, yes. In the short run, absolutely not. It's hard work. Why we do it? Because it's the right thing, not just because it puts a momentary smile on our face or makes us feel gleeful.
So I do want to go into the research there in more depth. Like he's definitely trying to put this at a level that anyone can understand. Essentially what the research shows is when you look at hedonic well-being, so like feelings of happiness generally, like just short-term feelings, versus eudaimonic well-being, which is like I feel like I'm doing things that I want to in life, I'm connecting to things that are meaningful to me. That's also really brief descriptions of them. But when you look at those general like short-lived states of happiness and like feeling gleeful, he's mentioning, are rated lower by parents. They rate generally that they're feeling those feelings less. But when you look at things like feeling like you're meeting your purpose or following things that are meaningful to you, and more long-term well-being, parents tend to rate that higher. As an example of this, earlier today, I was a little late getting to my first class and which is funny. It's like it's in my own house. I just have to come to my office to get to class on time. But I do have to have things open. I like to look over the slides again to make sure there's nothing really messed up. I did find one thing that was a little messed up, and I might mention it in a little bit. And I wasn't able to fix it. So I like to do that right before class. But my child was wanting coloring pages to be printed off. And so I ended up printing off coloring pages. He wanted me to show these to everybody too. because I said I can't print off more coloring pages right now because I've got my class meeting. But there's is purple diamond heart and another purple diamond heart. So I didn't really have the point here, other than just showing the silly pictures, cute pictures, is that I didn't necessarily in that moment have a lot of positive emotions. I was stressed, I was flustered. But overall, like, it's nice that I'm helping support that aspect of his development, and learning to draw and things like that. So that's kind of what they're getting at here. Parents tend to rate those positive emotions lower than other people, but long-term and eudaimonic well-being wise, they rate those higher. So this is related to also middle adulthood as well, in kind of that same way. Middle adults who have their children leaving the home might have, we talked about maybe a decrease in marital satisfaction because they're not having maybe those direct interactions that are as meaningful to them because they're not directly involved with raising those children.
Happiness is a product of our pursuits, not necessarily the pursuit of happiness per se, but the pursuit of other things that make life worth living. So if you take very seriously your work or your family or your community, if you pursue the good in those domains, guess what? You're going to be happy as a result. Sometimes when I give a talk and I tell the audience, if you really don't want to listen to me for the next hour, listen to me for 5 seconds because I'll tell you what positive psychology is all about. Other people matter, period. I'm done with my talk. Anything that builds relationships between and among people is going to make you happy. Now the other route is probably...
So that was the main thing I wanted to get across from this video, is that connection to other people matter. So the things that build connections between yourself, close friends, close family members, the community at large, these are the things that tend to be the biggest impact on our well-being, on our happiness, and they are very supportive. It's a big protective factor in people's health, their physical health, their socio-emotional health, their cognitive health. So having other people that they're close to and working with. So I think it's a really interesting thing to think about, and I'm going to be looking at the research that comes out of this after and through this pandemic, at how that has impacted people and relationships and that closeness and whatnot. So it's a question I'm really interested in to see what's actually coming out of research right now. But we're only beginning to start to see like the psych studies come out. I think we've talked about that before. A lot of times psych studies take a little longer to get out than, say, a medical study on, say, a vaccine that needs to get out right away. They change some systems around to be able to do that a little faster. Versus psych is like, no, we like our pattern of sending it a paper, and like 3 months later, we'll tell you if you need to rewrite things in it. It's a little frustrating system. He mentions a couple other points in positive psychology, but I think that's great right now. I think we will stop at that point and continue on and move into chapter 15. So in chapter 15, we're going to be focusing on physical health today, and probably next time we come to class will be when we talk about cognitive health. So the first thing I wanted to show you is actually another video, even though we just watched that video. This is Dr. Nakamura. She is a positive psychologist as well, positive developmental psychologist. Like, her first degree was developmental psychology. She focuses on late adulthood, middle and late adulthood, really. And positive psychology and developmental psychology have a lot of overlap. I've mentioned this earlier, that so many of the things that we're looking at for development and helping people thrive are the same thing positive psychologists find helps people do well and be happier and live good lives. So there's a lot of overlap there. So a developmental psych program is going to have a lot of overlap with a positive psych program. That's why I'm in one that does both, because it's very applied. So Dr. Nakamura will talk about aging. She's actually one of my advisors, works a lot with Dr. Csikszentmihalyi. We've seen his work on flow. She works on flow. I think she even mentions it in this video. So let's watch this. It's a really good one about aging and the things that we can do to have good or thriving times throughout our life in aging.
My name is Jean Nakamura, and I study aspects of positive adult development, including mentoring in the professional context and social innovation in the second half of life. We've been studying social innovators who are all over the age of 60, so in their 60s, 70s, 80s. We were interested in the question of how they came to be doing what they're doing. And the vast majority of them are people who were actively seeking something to do to contribute to society, and they weren't people who were tapped because of their expertise to do something to contribute to society. There were people who had sort of stumbled into a problem that they felt they couldn't ignore. And wound up feeling like they needed to take it on themselves. One example of these lives organized around social purpose was.
All right, so I wanted to make some comments about that part really quickly. Talking about how these late adults, well, middle to late adults who are getting involved and that they kind of just saw a need and then went to fit and fill that need. This is really related to a concept called direct action. You might have seen it just in news reports around activism, for example. But it's also really related to civic engagement more generally as well. So direct action is essentially just doing something there on the ground, like to work to solve a problem oftentimes or to support people. And so essentially the people that she's studying here are people who are doing that and are really successful at doing that, have even built up really big organizations to do that, oftentimes nonprofits. So an interesting thing is while at any age you can be really involved in direct action, it does seem that in middle and then late adulthood, it can be you oftentimes, so again, on average, you oftentimes have more talents and abilities and networks and sometimes money to leverage to build up and solve problems. So the people that she's talking about here are people that saw problems, say, in their community. She'll give a specific example in a minute that hopefully will make this more clear too. But they see something that needs to be done and they go and they do it. They try to solve the problem. They will network and bring in other people who want to work on that same problem and solve it. So this can be anything from homelessness to getting care for people who need it. There's a lot of overlap between those two populations for sure. Yeah, seeing something that needs to be done, not being trained over the course of their life to do it, but then in middle or late adulthood, they have these talent, skills, abilities, possibly more money that they can engage in this new pursuit. So obviously, I've mentioned the money a couple times. It can be easier when you have that kind of resource. But oftentimes these people are just starting off without money to work and solve a problem, getting other people to volunteer with it, leveraging their own talents and abilities and skills, finding other people with talents that match up well to theirs to work on this thing. So it seems to be a little easier. One of the main points I want to make here is it seems to be a little easier for middle and late adults to do that because it seems like they have that little bit larger network than maybe an adolescent might have. They haven't built that large of a network, or even an early adult might not have as large of a network to pull from. They might not have developed enough talents or as many talents. They obviously can, and that's not to say that an adolescent or a early adult can't also do really good work with direct action. It seems that a lot of times it's very successful or maybe easier. Maybe they have higher self-efficacy at doing it when they're in middle or late adulthood because they have all these resources to rely on. So many different skills that they've learned over their lifespan that they can apply in different ways or more creative ways to go about solving problems because of their expertise in different areas. oftentimes these people, like she was saying, haven't been trained to work on that specific problem or in this specific sphere, but other talents that they've gained make it easier to do that. So I find that interesting. And she'll mention a specific example with a veteran in a second here too.
An individual who had been a war vet, and when he was being treated in a VA hospital, was observing the young soldiers who had come back from the Gulf War, and realized that one of his own passions, which was fly fishing, might be something that he could share with them. And he created a program that allowed war veterans to go out into the country and experience a very restorative kind of healing activity. So essentially he was taking his own flow experiences and sharing them with these veterans. Yeah, so we've been learning from the research that we're conducting on the daily lives of older individuals whose lives are centered around a social purpose, that the work has both emotional and experiential costs, but also benefits, and that the benefits, like seeing the impact of one's work on others, outweigh the costs. Sort of traditional scripts for the retirement years are sort of centered around leisure. And the research that we're doing presents alternative possibilities. This has been called sort of the encore career, and the notion that another possible pathway for those years is giving back in one way or another.
All right, so this is really relevant to a lot of the things. You're going to see some overlap with other aspects of things that help people thrive at different times. But a lot of these are really useful, and we see can be more useful even in late adulthood. So I want to watch, I think, this example of positive aging. So there's some things in here. This is essentially a news report kind of describing how people are aging in this area in Germany, and some things that this specific individual is doing to stay young and feel young and be healthy and things like that. So definitely relevant to some of the physical and cognitive and socio-emotional things that we'll talk about, as well as connecting to what Dr. Nakamura was talking about there.
This is me, and this is my mother. There are nearly 40 years between us. I'd like to be like her when I get old, an 81-year-old who's full of beans.
Sure, I could come over here every day and do my gymnastics in the park.
People in Germany are getting older, and as long as their health holds out, they continue to be active as they age. How old do you feel?
Oh, that's a tough question. I usually ask people how old they think I am. But how old do I feel? I'd say mid-60s or so. Certainly not as old as I really am, thank goodness.
What's your life motto?
My motto in life is to try to not come to a standstill, to stay active, continue to look for and experience new things. When you come across something new, don't think, oh, you don't need to try that, it's not worth it at your age. But just give it a go.
That attitude makes people like my mother attractive for many companies. These so-called youthful seniors want to lead independent lives, and that means they're an important part of consumer society. And they're not averse to modern technology. Do you see how the colors are changing? That happens a lot on the internet. When you swipe over something with the mouse and the color changes, then you know you can click on it. It's like a button you can push.
Okay, but it's not doing anything. Why isn't it reacting?
My mother's generally unfazed, even when things get complicated.
I'm pretty persistent. Once I've started something and feel I need to learn how to do it, then I stick with it until I can, even if it's difficult. And I have to swear at myself a little. I say, Biggie, don't be stupid. Just keep on trying. I give myself a little pep talk, and that usually works.
So there's been a couple good examples here of some things that we've talked about already. One thing I want to mention here specifically is that character strength of probably love of learning as well as persistence. And so building those and using those in different ways, she's able to, want to learn new things, try it, and stick to it, even if it's a challenge. So.
Mir selber Mut zu. Und das klappt manchmal oder meistens.
For my mother, taking trips is a way of staying active in old age. Travel-loving seniors have become a lucrative market for tour operators. Special travel clubs offer package tours for them. My mother's happy to spend her money on that and make her remaining years pleasant.
I don't spend much time dwelling on the future. Who knows what might happen in a week or in 6 months? I try not to think about that too much. I don't feel old, and I hope that's the way it stays for a while.
Living in the here and now.
So we see a couple different things in that. One is relationship with family, family's still there and around. Relationships with friends. I'm guessing the people in the picture, like with the ships behind them, were friends that she's probably gone on multiple trips and cruises with. So close friends, being active, going out to say even just a local park or a mall and things like that. These are all really beneficial for late adults to keep connected, to keep their cognitive health up, to keep their physical health up. She mentioned doing gymnastics in the park, so physical health benefits there. It always makes me a little sad watching this, just some random news report, and they're like, "Hey, seniors are important for the economy." Like, hey, businesses care about them because they're still part of that system. It's like, well, isn't it just good enough that they can live a good life and be okay? It's a frustrating thing to see so often. It's like, yeah, but older people are important because they can still be part of the economy. I mean, that's an argument you've got to make in some cases to get things like care for people who are older funded. There is a lot of ageism, not just in the capitalist system, but just in general for people. There is a lot of ageism and thinking that people aren't really capable as they get older of doing a lot of things. And hopefully some of the examples we've seen and I'm showing and we're talking about help dissuade any of those kind of ideas or preconceptions of aging as well. So with that, here is actually a really interesting example that I wanted to show you. You don't have to read all this slide right now. Essentially what this slide is how I tend to take notes on a research article. So you're all probably working on at least thinking about your second question paper, writing notes on it, including it into your paper. When I read a research article, I write notes on it, depending on how important it is to the work I'm doing or relevant. There might be a couple pages of notes, or it might be as short as this, depending on what I need. So usually it's about twice as long as this for something that's not super relevant, but I definitely want to remember the information. So here I've got a little bit of the topic. So this paper was on a model of successful development. I've got a quote from the paper, and then these were the 6 common conditions for successful aging. So this specific paper is relevant to late adulthood. That's why I'm showing it here. Also, towards the end of the class, I want to show you this is one way I take my notes. It might give you some ideas for you going further in your careers and whatnot. So I've essentially just listed the common conditions. If I felt like any of these needed more descriptions, I would have sub-bullet points. One thing that I didn't include here, just so it's bigger and easier to read, I do have another bullet in my actual notes on the methods that they use to do the study. So I've mentioned methods quite a few times. Methods is the scientific method. What was the science that they did to find these findings in this study? So generally, for a paper that's not directly relevant to my main research interest, I'll have about half a page to a page that has like the general description of the study, some of the primary findings, and the methods that they used. And that's how I'll take notes on things. So this next slide is built from those notes. So if you look at these 6 things, they are the 6 things here in this area, the 6 common conditions for successful aging. So when I prep for a class or something like that, I'm reading the research or rereading the research usually that I've read before on successful aging. I'll look up what's the new research and things like that rather than just going for a textbook. Textbooks are good. They probably have these points because 1998, it's old enough research. Textbooks should have picked it up by now and included it, or the same kind of ideas. So hopefully that shows you one way that I do take notes on a research paper. That might help you in taking your own notes to see how I do it. But that's really why I wanted that there. So here's the more visually interesting example, the 6 most common things that we see in development as well as positive psychology, because again, there's a lot of overlap there at late adulthood. Health and fitness is one of the most important things. So being physically active, eating healthily, preserving the mind. So we've seen that some of those cognitive capacities stay pretty consistent. Then they start to drop off near late adulthood. So preserving those capacities, doing things, will be a lot of the cognitive pieces of this chapter. Continuing vocation. So we just saw that discussion from Nakamura, the different ways that you can have a post-retirement career. So it could be something like that. It could be just continuing your career, continuing your hobbies. My father-in-law has continued after his retirement to still do some of the same hobbies like woodworking and doing house maintenance. So he really likes doing those things and essentially just constructing and building things. So that's kind of a continued vocation there. Keeping up relationships with family and friends. We've mentioned this quite a few times, given a couple different examples. We'll get some more still in the socio-emotional learning chapter. Staying involved in the community. There's lots of different ways to do that. Nakamura's examples of doing direct action, building your own organization that takes veterans fly fishing. That's a really good example of being involved in the community and solving a problem or supporting people in that sphere and area. There's other ways. There's organizations that already exist, YMCA, for example, or other organizations. I just say that because that's the shirts they're wearing. And then beyond the self engagement. A lot of these things are engaging beyond the self. So if you're keeping up relationships, that's beyond yourself with other people, involved in the community, that's beyond yourself. Your vocation might not necessarily be beyond yourself. Maybe you are creating something to give to other people, but your continued vocation may just be for you. So we'll see some examples of other continued vocations in our socio-emotional learning chapters. There's actually a photographer who I always like watching as we get to this point in class, who's kind of inspiring to me to continue with that hobby, because that's a hobby I share as well and don't do as much of as I would like. All right, so let's talk about longevity and aging and why do we age and why is our lifespan what it is. So lifespan is the maximum number of years a person can live. It seems that for humans, our maximum, like our top limit for years lived is about 120 to 125. So that's essentially the biological maximum that humans can live to. So not everybody's obviously going to get to that point. The average age, actually it's right here. The estimates for 2030 for the average age lived is going to be 83 for women and 79 for men. So obviously that's a couple years off of that. And there's a couple different reasons for that. We'll talk about that in the next couple minutes. It is fairly rare to get past 100, even though it is possible to get to 120 or even 125. But that is like the biological cap, the maximum that humans, it seems, can get to. So with this, there is difference in life expectancy across countries. So health conditions, medical care has a big impact. So more support, more facilities. So this person is on a track and there's a bunch of weight machines here. So this facility is open to this person. They're able to access it. They have a place to walk, a place to be safe. There might even be healthcare professionals around too. It might be in a nursing home. So having more medical care, more facilities to support health at lower cost or no cost to the people is good. It helps extend life. There's also ethnic differences, which are oftentimes, as we've discussed, really confounded with socioeconomic status variables. So it's hard to say if that's actually ethnic differences or is that socioeconomic status. So if you don't have money to go see the doctor, you're probably not going to be as healthy. So let's talk about centenarians. These are people who are 100 years or older. This is increasing every year. People around the world are turning 100 and living longer. So 100 years and older, it's increasing at about a rate of 7% each year. So with this, I've mentioned this before. Okinawa is a place in Japan that has about 34.7 centenarians for every 100,000 inhabitants. So that's a lot higher than most places than any other place in the world that we have the numbers for. So there was a video, an interview with these people, and I think it's a really good one to watch. Maybe search for it yourself. I didn't actually include the link here. I think since it's all in Japanese and they don't dub it, it's a little harder to watch, and like with the grainy pixelated, like expect everybody to read at the same speed. I don't want to have it there. But if you want to watch it, go for it. I just think this kind of comment is funny when they're asked, why do you live so long? Because we have a lot of fish in this village. So interestingly though, a diet with fish and the fish oil does tend to be really good for cognitive abilities. So why are people in Okinawa, why are they living past 100? One of the big things is their diet. The kind of diet that they're eating tends to be really good for aging bodies. They also have a low stress lifestyle, and we've mentioned this before in middle adulthood. It's really relevant here, and we'll talk about it again today in a few minutes. So decreasing stress is diet and stress are some of the things that an individual can do and actually have an impact on, hopefully. Obviously, there's limitations to that within the systems. If you have less money, it can be harder to access healthy foods. If you have high stress jobs and you have to continue in those high stress jobs, that can decrease your lifespan. So not great. Having a caring community, the culture there is a lot more communal. So there's a lot more people who can help if you have limited mobility, if you need something moved, if you need a plant out of your garden. So there's more connection and more relying on other people that way. Activity as well. You are one of the people who are going and helping other people do things. Also, there's a lot of spirituality as well as religion in this area. And so that helps people come and connect together in the community for those kinds of spiritual or religious events and rituals. So those are just some of the things that, some of the primary factors of why Okinawa has so many people who live past 100. So maybe some good things to look at because they tend to be happy and living healthily. And yeah. So let's look as well at Okinawa compared to Japan, compared to the US for risks of dying from cancer, which is one chronic condition that does become more prevalent as we age, but it's not only prevalent in older adults. So we see, let's look at this example because it's maybe one of the more dramatic ovarian and breast cancer rates. So this is per 1,000 people. So per 1,000 people in Okinawa, there's about 6 that will die from breast cancer versus 11 in Japan versus 33 in the US. So bad job, US. Maybe some things we can learn to change and do a better job so people are not dying from cancer. Would be good. So what are some other reasons we age? So cancer, diseases, those are things that we can work on, but also why is that 120, 125? Why is that the limit? Well, there's a couple different reasons why. And it's probably not just one of these. It's probably all of them kind of mixed together. So let's talk about them. The evolutionary theory, I think we've mentioned this before. So we have adapted to reproduce and continue the species, right? So anything that's linked to reproductive fitness has really well, over time, over millennia, been naturally selected in or out to increase reproductive fitness. So when you get and you're looking at a person who's 80, they can help in the reproductive process. I mean, a man at that age could pass on genetic material to have a newborn child, versus a woman post-menopause could not have a newborn child. But aside from that, the a person who is healthier, who can help take care of children, who can be a support to childbearing and child rearing, that kind of thing is still naturally selected for, just not as it's just not as much of the focus of evolution. Evolution is like primarily around the specific reproductive fitness of the organism, but the things that can be supportive to that reproductive fitness are also selected in and out. So when you look at an 80-year-old versus 20-year-old, a lot of those physical capacities might not be as evolution isn't like a conscious experience, like saying, hey, we don't have to worry about that, but you could think of it that way, I guess, as well. So one thing in regards to that, again, some of these are overlapping. It's probably all of these things together. The cellular clock theory is the idea that a lot of different cells in our body can divide only a maximum of like 75 to 80 times. Now, some cells don't divide at all, like your neurons. The only way you get new neurons is from a stem cell becoming a neuron. Your neurons in your brain don't replicate themselves, although that would be great if they could do that, and then, but that would lead to completely different neurology in humans as well. I can't even imagine what that would actually be like. So with that, some cells divide less than this, some cells divide more than this. That's my main point there. Sorry about my tangents. With that, age makes cells less capable of dividing. And there's a couple different reasons behind this. One of them are telomeres. So telomeres are the ending of your DNA sequence. It's basically a bunch of extra DNA code that isn't important for actually running biological processes, other than the fact that it protects the important chunks of DNA. So every cell in your body has a nucleus and a bunch of chromosomes in it, and each of those chromosomes is essentially just your DNA wound up in a specific pattern. So here you've got your ATCG, your specific molecules that are your DNA, and this ending bit, this red bit here, or this black bit here, is the telomere. You can think of it as the aglet on a, did I say that right? Aglet on a shoelace. So that little hard part at the end is there to keep the shoelace from fraying. You can get it through the holes in your shoes easier that way too. So the aglet protects it if that gets, say, cut off or over time rubbed off. Say you like step on your shoelace, the main part of the shoelace will start to fray. Same kind of thing with the DNA. As we replicate a cell over time, as the RNA is reading and the different proteins are reading the DNA to copy it over, most of the time it makes mistakes at the end points. It doesn't usually make mistakes in the middle, although it can happen. Most often the mistakes happen at the end. So if you're reading this whole bit of DNA and copying it, and maybe these 5 molecules at the end of the sequence get deleted because they don't get copied over right. So essentially your telomeres are shortening over time. So that's what this is showing. It gets divided once, still pretty long, divided twice, it gets a little shorter. So essentially those telomeres, we've evolved that capacity to have these longer extra bits of DNA sequence so that there's some that can be chopped off to allow us to have more time to live and reproduce and be biologically fit. But at about that point, in our hundreds, those telomeres have gotten too short. And once you start cutting into, I guess you could call it the meat of the DNA, you're now messing up with how cells are functioning, how organs are functioning, how your body is doing things. And so then you could have things like cancer or organ failure, both. And this is one reason why we will age, is because of those telomeres. They get chopped off over time because of problems with replication, and that is about the time that it's happening. So that's related to the cellular clock theory, related also to evolutionary theory that hasn't been completely selected out yet. So free radical theory. So you might have heard of free radicals before. A lot of people who you'll hear mention it don't really know what they're talking about with free radicals. Essentially, it means it's an unstable oxygen molecule, usually an ion, like it's oxygen that's positively or negatively charged. And the molecule itself can damage cellular structures or DNA. And so if you've damaged that DNA, let's say in the middle, and then you replicate that DNA, that cell is not going to be working quite as properly as it should. Organ failure again. So those oxygen molecules can damage things. You can almost think of it as, say, a car rusting because of oxygen and exposure and that oxidizing. You could think of it in the same way inside the body. So parts of your cell are oxidizing. It's not exactly the same, but kind of similar in that it's literally damaging parts of your chromosomes or parts of your cell. Then when it replicates, it doesn't replicate properly. You can have things like organ failure, things like that, when you build up enough of that. So over time, that just happens more and more. It's just totally random. So as you've been alive longer, there's more of a likelihood that you're going to have those bits of your cells damaged by those oxygen molecules. Mitochondrial theory, mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell. If they're not working as well, they're not able to transfer energy across the cell in appropriate ways as they should, the cells aren't going to live as long, the cells might die. So if you think of that as like your heart muscles, if those cells themselves are dying because they can't use energy themselves well, then your heart might eventually, with enough of that, fail. So also some other theories here. You don't need to know, a lot of these are really similar, but they're talking about specific aspects of cellular division or change that can end up leading to aging and death. So I want you to get the main overarching picture. That's why I talked in so much detail about telomeres and the cell theory in general. So this specific theory, sirtuin theory, is that proteins linked to longevity, mitochondria, the proteins do jobs in cells, replicating DNA. If they're not repairing things, if they are copying things incorrectly, leads to aging. Similar with the mTOR pathway theory. So this is the growth and metabolism of the cell itself. Again, just a different process by which cells might be dying or not functioning as well as they should be. So again, if you think of a heart cell or lung cell, if it's not doing as good of a job keeping itself alive, then the whole organ, if that's happening across the whole organ, you might have problems across that whole organ. So just a couple different points of how and why we age. This happens more and more as we're getting older, as we've been around enough years. It's more and more likely that any of these or multiple of these are combining. And so because of all those combining together, it's a perfect storm of bad stuff for your body, and that's why our limit is about 120 to 125 years to be alive. Stress. Stress is the last one I actually do want to focus on a little bit, because hopefully you remember from our discussions of neurology that the endocrine system is part of your nervous system. So usually we focus on like the brain, the neurons, the brain stem, but your organs that produce hormones are part of it too, are part of your nervous system. And so if you have more stress in your life, your body is going to be doing a worse job at fighting diseases. Your body's going to be doing a worse job of cognitive tasks. Maybe you're not going to be able to focus as well or plan as well. Your neurons aren't going to be working quite as fast. And so for a lot of different reasons, stress impacts so many systems in the body that it decreases your lifespan. So it's another aspect of aging. And one reason why people in Okinawa, because of their lower stress lifestyle, having more supports around them, having healthcare that's better, all these things together, proper diet, physical exercise being encouraged, and having that kind of cultural system around being more active even in older age, leads them to have such lower stress and helps with having much longer life. So, I thought there was a couple more points there. But yeah, stress is one of the things I definitely want to focus on, because while you and I, in my daily life, I can't like eat a specific vitamin to make my telomeres regrow, right? I can't stop that from happening. That's just cell division. Sometimes it screws up and deletes part of that telomere. But stress is something we should hopefully be able to manage a little bit. like I said, if you're in a high stress occupation and you're still in that high stress occupation, there's not as much as you can do as if you could choose to do something else to de-stress. But you can still, even in that high stress occupation, do things to reduce your stress. So this is one reason I want to focus on the hormonal stress theory, because it's one thing that individuals can actually influence, versus we as individuals can't really influence our telomeres as far as we know now. Maybe 10 years from now, we'll find a specific kind of supplement or set of chemicals that can protect telomeres even better, have little shields around our telomeres as they get replicated. That would be neat. And there are definitely scientists working on that. But for what you and I can do, decrease stress. All right. So the brain tends to lose about 5 to 10% of its mass and weight between ages of about 20 and 90. So think back to our discussions of neurology, how the brain grows and develops at about age 2, how it's almost at the same weight as it will be in adulthood. So some of those same things are kind of happening in reverse here. So with that being said, why do you think the brain is decreasing its volume? So what is actually physically happening? What is making this decrease in volume in the brain? Either use the microphone or put it in the meeting chat. No ideas? Do we remember how the brain is structured? What ends up leading to so much mass increase at about age 2? Think of things like maybe pruning. Try not to just give the answer out there, especially since this is definitely one thing that's going to be on your final exam. So one of the examples of things that you'll probably want to review for the final exam. So what are some reasons the brain's volume might be decreasing? What's happening to the neural structures? So that's a good suggestion. I see one comment now. Is it because it's done growing? Losing neuroplasticity is another idea. So some good thoughts here. So we do get to about full brain capacity, neural capacity, weight, mass, myelination early on in our 20s, but plasticity still exists throughout adulthood. Sierra's comment of losing neuroplasticity does tend to be on average one thing that is happening. Now we don't technically lose neuroplasticity, like the ability for the brain to adjust, but on average, people who are in maybe a more stable midlife will be losing specific pathways. And this is what most of the weight and mass loss in the brain is due to, because it essentially isn't growing. It's now shrinking because you're not using all the connections. If you're not doing new things or using things that you already have cognitively, you're going to start actually losing mass of your brain. So part of it, a lot of it is due to the lower number of synapses. So that's the axons. Let's say your axon had maybe 5 branches before, maybe it goes down to 3 instead. So those, if that happens all over your brain, going down from 5 branches to 3 is going to amount to some of the mass of your brain. And so that being said, you still have the capacity for plasticity. So if you start using those connections again, learning a new language, playing games, being more active, you can get those back. One other thing, though, is the shrinkage of neurons. The same reasons that our heart starts to not function as well, circulatory system starts to not function as well. Also, those blood systems going to your brain, if they're having problems, if they're shrinking, if they're getting harder, it might be having your brain in general might be getting less nutrients, less oxygen, less minerals that it needs to run each of those individual cells. If that happens, the neurons themselves can shrink. So technically we don't lose neuroplasticity, but we do lose some of the connections if we're not using them. So we still have the capacity for plasticity. So I definitely want to make that a clarification there. But yeah, very good. But yeah, once it's done growing, if you're not using your brain system, you will start to, your brain wants to be efficient, wants to be an efficient computer. If you have, say, my computer's capable of plugging in 2 graphics cards at the same time and running them together. You could think of that as 2 different pathways for neurons. If I'm not actually using those 2 graphics cards, it's still running power to both of them. If your brain doesn't need to be running as much power or sending as much nutrients to specific neurons or specific branches, it's not going to. For my computer, I'd actually have to like uninstall that graphics card. Your brain will just do that automatically to try and be more efficient with the energy it's using. So maybe only a relevant example to a few of you. I guess you could say it's kind of like plugging in things. This one's pretty similar. You have an outlet plugged to a wall, so like a power strip. And you've got your computer, you've got your TV, you've got some speakers, you've got your alarm clock, all plugged into that. So it's drawing more power from the wall to grab all of those. That's what your neurons do. They draw some energy, some nutrients to them through blood flow. If you're using it, it's going to be pulling more power. So if you're using all of those devices, it's pulling more power through the wall. Same thing with your neurons. So if you're not using a few of those things, essentially what your brain will do will kind of be unplug different branches of axons or dendrites. So probably more relevant example to most people. Probably all of you have plugged and unplugged things in a wall rather than as many of you plugging in multiple graphics cards. So with this, we tend to see that in late adulthood, we see some slowing of cognitive faculties. We saw that longitudinal study, things dropping off as we get to late adulthood. That being said, it doesn't have to happen. We'll talk a lot in the cognitive chapter next time, we'll get to it, of ways that you can increase your cognitive capacities. But this also affects things like physical coordination, like losing balance, hand-eye coordination, speed of processing. This is some of the reason why it can be harder for people who are older to drive, because there are so many things to look at and focus on at the same time. If your speed of processing is a little slower, that can make a big difference. So this is also why people who are high-level race car drivers or motorbike riders tend to be a little younger because of the neural connections. Again, this is something that's plastic. You can, by working on them, increase those connections and capacities, but on average, people do not. A reminder, neurogenesis only happens in a couple places in the brain. So that's a stem cell turning into a new neuron. So, I mean, it's possible we might find that it's happening in more places in our brain, but it seems like we only have 1 or 2 specific places where this happens, and that's not really enough to reverse the impact of all these other things. So the best thing is to help your brain continue to be more plastic. One thing the brain does is uses both hemispheres to generally what the brain does is use lateralization processes, or using multiple areas of the brain to process things. It can be more efficient to use the areas of the brain closer to each other. So rather than using two hemispheres and going across that corpus callosum, sending a message a long way, it can be more energy efficient to use only neurons close by. So your brain will learn how to do that essentially over time. So some physical changes that you might see: wrinkles, age spots. People tend to be getting shorter in late adulthood. Again, we talked about this last time. The vertebrae is a big part of this, the connective tissue to support the spine. People tend to shrink and hunch over as they age. We also lose a lot of weight. A lot of that is from muscle, but also from bones. This increases the risks of falling, makes physical capacities a lot harder. Also, here's the thing I saw was wrong in my slides that I didn't have time to fix. The text here is too big, or I've put too much on this slide, but I didn't have time to fix that. So older adults more slowly than younger adults. So here's a breakdown on average. So this is, again, the middle of the bell curve. So at age 25, we're about 30% muscle, 40% organ weight, basically, water, things like that, 20% fat, and 10% bone. Age 75, that 10% bone has gone down to 8%. That 30% fat has, 30% muscle has dropped down to 15% muscle, and then 20% fat has jumped up to 40% fat. So again, this is on average. If you have healthier diet, or if you're exercising regularly, it will be better for you as an individual. But people just tend to, on average, this is about where people are falling into in the normal distribution. So a lot of bad news, it sounds like, right? So a lot of this sounds really negative. Sensory development, we often have more cataracts, glaucoma, macular degeneration, cardiovascular problems linked to neuron problems. One thing that I definitely want to point out is sleep in adulthood. So we talked about in middle adulthood, the number was like 30% or something like that. So more and more people in between early adulthood to middle adulthood to late adulthood are having more sleeping problems. So whether that's sleepwalking, whether that's insomnia, whether that's sleep apnea, and this can lead to a lot of cognitive challenges. So mental health challenges, feeling tired, not having the energy to go and exercise, lower cognitive function, making driving harder, making playing games harder, makes you not want to do those things. But with that being said, sleeping too much is predictive of early death. So if you're just lying in bed and sleeping a lot of the day, it's also likely that you will die earlier. So there's kind of a golden time there, or a perfect ratio of sleep to being awake. Also, this is a really good example of, again, talking to a doctor specifically about what your specific symptoms are that you have, the sleep that you're doing, the sleep problems you might be having, and what to do in your own life to support your own health long term. Because these are, again, we're talking a lot about averages here. And so if the doctor is able to know all of these averages and what people generally have and treatments and things like that, they'll be able to better pinpoint for you the care you should have. So maybe all your sleep problems will be solved with a CPAP machine if you have sleep apnea and never knew about it. That's a fairly easy solution that might make your sleep better, might decrease your stress, might increase your mental health, might increase your cognitive functioning, make you feel like you can be more active. So talking to a doctor about your individual situation is really important. This is essentially a breakdown of some visual and hearing loss from 65 to 74 and then 75 and on. So essentially, even in late adulthood, we still keep a lot of our capacities for quite a while. And then once we get to late adulthood, then they start to drop off. So maybe we'll start here next time. This is, yes, 11:20. Class is supposed to be ending here. I wanted to get a little further in physical development. But we can start here next time. So let me know if you have any questions about the field of psychology in general, like I was mentioning at the beginning. So like degrees, programs, things that you might want to go into. We will finish up with physical health, and a lot of our time next time will be spent on cognitive health, and we probably start on socio-emotional development in late adulthood as well. So thanks for being here today. Have a great weekend.